Let me start by saying that I've always been into weird shit. The type of kid who'd rather watch conspiracy documentaries at 3 a.m. than go to a party. I don't know if that says more about me or my crappy social life, but whatever. The point is, I've always had this morbid curiosity about the stuff most people wouldn't even think about. Ghosts, cryptids, urban legends, you name it. So, when I was in my early 20s, broke as hell and desperate for money, I made what was probably the dumbest decision of my life. I signed up for a job as a paranormal investigator on the dark web. Yeah, you read that right. The dark web. I had been poking around on it for months, mostly out of boredom. You'd be surprised at how easy it is to access, by the way. Just download a Tor browser and boom, you're in. Most of it's just scams and shady marketplaces, but every once in a while you'll find something that makes your stomach drop. That's how I stumbled across a forum called Veil Seekers. It looked like your standard ghost hunter community at first glance. People sharing blurry photos of ghosts, tips on how to cleanse a haunted house, that kind of thing. But the deeper you went, the darker it got. They weren't just talking about haunted houses. They were talking about abandoned asylums, forests where people went missing, and rituals that supposedly opened gateways to other dimensions. And then there were the job postings, offers to investigate locations that no one else dared to touch. Some of the payouts were insane, like $50,000 for a single night. But the descriptions were vague and ominous, stuff like, investigate an abandoned factory, bring a weapon, do not leave until dawn. I needed money. My roommate had just bailed on rent, and my car was one breakdown away from becoming scrap metal. I figured, what the hell? I was skeptical about the paranormal anyway. I thought it'd be an easy gig, so I replied to one of the posts. The job description was simple. Investigate a rural property in the middle of nowhere. Reports of unnatural sounds and sightings, $10,000 for 12 hours of footage. They sent me the coordinates and told me to bring a camera, a flashlight, and a weapon. I didn't have a gun, so I grabbed the biggest knife I could find in my kitchen. Looking back, it was laughable how unprepared I was. The property was about 3 hours out of town, way off the main road. No cell service, of course. It was just me, my crappy car, and a dirt path that seemed to stretch on forever. The sun was setting by the time I got there, which was exactly what they wanted. The activity starts after dark, they'd said. When I pulled up, I realized this wasn't some regular haunted house. It was a farm, but everything about it felt wrong. The main house was barely standing, its roof caved in and windows shattered. There was a barn to the left, and beyond that, just endless fields of dead crops. The air smelled like rot, like something had been decomposing here for a long time. I parked my car close to the road, just in case I needed to bolt, and started filming as I walked toward the house. The front door was already open, hanging on one hinge, creaking in the wind. Inside, the place was a disaster. Furniture overturned, claw marks on the walls, yes, actual claw marks, and something that looked like dried blood smeared across the floor. I tried to tell myself it was just some messed up teenagers vandalizing the place, but my gut was screaming at me to get out. Then I heard it. It was this low, guttural growl coming from upstairs, not like a dog or a coyote, something deeper, something that didn't sound natural. I froze. Every instinct in my body told me to leave, but then I remembered the money. 12 hours, I muttered to myself. Just 12 hours. I crept up the stairs, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The growling stopped as soon as I reached the second floor, which somehow made it worse. The silence was deafening. There were only 2 rooms up there, both with doors slightly ajar. I decided to check the one on the left first. The second I stepped inside, the smell hit me. It was like someone had dumped a bucket of roadkill in there. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and pointed the flashlight around the room. The walls were covered in what looked like symbols, circles, triangles, and lines that didn't make any sense to me. In the middle of the room was a pile of bones, human bones. I'm not exaggerating. There was a skull, rib cages, and way too many femurs for it to just be one person. I stumbled back, trying not to vomit, and that's when I saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room. It wasn't cast by my flashlight. It was just there, darker than the rest of the room, and it moved. I didn't even think. I ran out of that room, slamming the door behind me, and bolted down the stairs. But as I reached the front door, I heard something behind me, this wet, slapping sound, like someone dragging a soaked towel across the floor. I whipped around and there it was. It was crawling down the stairs on all fours, but its limbs were wrong, too long, bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Its face, or whatever the hell you'd call it, was just a hole. A gaping black void that seemed to suck in the light around it. And the smell. God, the smell. It was like it brought the room with it, filling the air with rot and decay. I didn't think I'd make it out alive. My legs felt like jelly, but somehow I forced them to move. I ran out the door and straight to my car, fumbling with the keys as I heard that thing screeching behind me. I don't even know how I managed to start the car, but I did, and I floored it down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, shaking and covered in sweat. I checked my phone, hoping I could at least contact the person who hired me, but all the messages were gone. The forum, gone. It was like the job never existed. When I got home, I locked every door and window in my apartment and slept with the lights on. But the worst part, that wasn't the end. It followed me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the same wet, slapping sound outside my door. And then the whispering started. I don't even know how to explain what happened next. I barely slept after I got home. Hell, I barely even blinked. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that thing crawling toward me, hear that awful screech in my head. I had all the lights on, and I kept the knife I'd taken with me from the job, clutched in my hand like it would actually help. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to think I might have imagined it all, that maybe it was some kind of hallucination or a really vivid nightmare, I heard the sound. That wet, slapping noise. The same noise I heard in the house. It wasn't outside, it was inside. My stomach dropped. I froze, knife in hand, straining to hear where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My apartment isn't big. It's a crappy one-bedroom with a short hallway that leads straight to the living room. If something was in the hallway, it was right there. Then came the whispering. It wasn't in a language I could understand. It sounded like dozens of voices overlapping, some low and guttural, others high-pitched and shrill, all speaking in this horrible, inhuman rhythm. It wasn't like they were trying to talk to me. It was like they were reciting something, a chant maybe, or a curse. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding so hard. I thought I was going to pass out. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone was in the living room, and there was no way I was stepping out of my room. I thought about jumping out the window, but I lived on the 3rd floor. If I didn't break my legs, I'd definitely break something else. The whispering stopped suddenly, and for a moment, the silence was worse. Then came a knock. 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 It wasn't loud, just soft, deliberate taps on the bedroom door. I tightened my grip on the knife, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. That's when I noticed something else. The smell. That same rancid stench from the house, rotting flesh like something had been dead for weeks. It was seeping under the door now, thick and suffocating. I covered my nose and mouth, trying not to gag, but it didn't help. It was everywhere. I don't know how long I sat there paralyzed with fear. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't mean anything in that moment. I just kept staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The doorknob started to turn. I don't even remember deciding to move. 1 second I was sitting on the bed. The next, I was sprinting across the room, slamming my weight against the door to keep it shut. I braced myself against it, knife in hand, and screamed, "Who's there? What do you want?" No answer. Just more of that horrible whispering, louder now, coming from the other side of the door. And then, nothing. The pressure on the doorknob stopped. The smell started to fade. The air felt lighter, like whatever was there had left. I stayed there for hours, pressed against the door, until the sun came up. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, the hallway was empty. No smell, no scratches, no signs that anything had been there at all. But I knew it had. That morning, I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I saw it. In the mirror. There was something on my chest, just above my heart. A mark. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. It looked like a burn about the size of a quarter, shaped like one of those symbols I'd seen on the walls of the house. A circle with a triangle inside it, and 3 small lines cutting through the middle. I touched it, expecting it to hurt, but it didn't. The skin wasn't raised or tender, it felt like it had always been there. I tried scrubbing it off with soap and water, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't going away. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound, constantly checking over my shoulder. I didn't go to work, didn't eat, didn't do anything except sit in my apartment, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. But the day passed without incident. By the time night rolled around, I almost started to believe I was in the clear. I was wrong. I woke up around midnight to the sound of scratching. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time, it was coming from inside my room. I sat up, my heart pounding, and turned on the lamp. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed the closet door. It was open, just a crack. Now I know what you're thinking. Why the hell didn't you close it? I did, I always do. But there it was, slightly ajar, like someone had been watching me sleep. I grabbed the knife from the nightstand and stood up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But where the hell was I supposed to go? I didn't have anywhere else to stay, and even if I did, I wasn't sure this thing wouldn't follow me. I walked toward the closet, knife shaking in my hand. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, like I'd just stepped into a freezer. When I was close enough to reach the door, I stopped. There were fingers, long, thin fingers wrapped around the edge of the door. They didn't move, just stayed there, gripping the wood like they were waiting for me to open it. I didn't. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the closet, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. I didn't even know who I was going to call. The cops? What the hell would I tell them? But when I unlocked the screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The camera app was open, and there was a photo. It was of me, sleeping, taken from inside the closet. I didn't stay in the apartment after that. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and bolted. I drove aimlessly for hours, too scared to go home, too scared to tell anyone what had happened. I thought about going to a motel, but I didn't feel safe anywhere. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. It had marked me, and somehow I knew it was just getting started. After driving for what felt like hours, I pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. You know the kind with flickering neon signs, peeling paint, and an office that smells like stale cigarettes. I figured it was the last place anyone or anything would think to look for me. The clerk didn't ask questions, which was a relief. He was this older guy with greasy hair and a permanent scowl, probably more interested in finishing his crossword than dealing with me. I paid in cash, took the key, and headed to my room. It was number 13. Great, like I didn't have enough bad luck already. The room itself was, well, it was a motel room. Dingy carpet, a bed that sagged in the middle, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked since the early 2000s. The only upside was the lock on the door. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed, knife still clutched in my hand, and tried to think. My brain was running on fumes, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. I kept replaying the events of the last 2 days in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The shadow, the mark, the photo on my phone. It didn't feel real. It felt like I was stuck in some fucked up dream I couldn't wake up from. I checked my phone again, hoping I'd missed a call or message from someone who could help. But all I saw was that photo. Me, sleeping. The longer I stared at it, the more I noticed. In the background, just behind me, were 2 glowing eyes. They weren't obvious at first, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. They were faint, almost like they were reflecting light, but they were definitely there. Watching. I deleted the photo. I didn't want to see it anymore, but as soon as I closed the gallery, another notification popped up. New photos saved. My stomach dropped. I opened the gallery again, and there it was, a new photo. The same angle, the same setting, but this time I was awake, sitting on the bed, staring at my phone. I dropped the phone like it burned me, my breathing ragged. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the knife. I looked around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow, but I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The first thing I did was cover the mirror. I don't know why, but I couldn't stand the thought of seeing something in the reflection that wasn't supposed to be there. I used the scratchy motel towel and draped it over the glass, then pushed the dresser in front of the closet door. It didn't have a lock, and I wasn't taking any chances. By then, it was close to 2 a.m. and I was running on pure paranoia. I sat with my back against the headboard, knife in one hand and flashlight in the other, just waiting for something to happen. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. Then I saw the eyes. They were outside the window staring in. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the longer I looked, the more real they became. 2 pale, glowing orbs just floating in the darkness. They didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared. The curtains were thin, barely covering the window, so I couldn't see what the eyes were attached to. For all I knew, it was just the reflection of car headlights or something equally harmless. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it watching me, like its gaze was boring into my soul. I should have stayed put. I should have ignored it, pretended it wasn't there. But instead, I did the dumbest thing imaginable. I got up and pulled the curtains aside. There was nothing there. Just an empty parking lot and the dim glow of the motel sign. The eyes were gone. For a second, I almost convinced myself that I really was losing it. But as I turned away from the window, I saw something on the glass. A handprint. It wasn't mine, it was huge, with long, bony fingers and nails that looked more like claws. The sight of it made my stomach churn, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair by the bed. The handprint started to fade, like it was evaporating. I didn't wait for it to disappear completely. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I was getting the hell out of there. I barely made it 5 steps before I heard it. A low, guttural growl, the same one I'd heard in the house. It was coming from the bathroom. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, and saw the door creak open. The bathroom was pitch black, but I could see something moving in the shadows. It was crawling toward me, its limbs twisted and unnatural, its face, if you could even call it that, nothing but darkness. And those eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes. I ran. I didn't care about my bag or the money I'd spent on the room. I sprinted out the door, barefoot, knife still in my hand, and didn't stop until I was in my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition, but I managed. I floored it out of the parking lot, not even bothering to look back. I drove until the sun came up, too scared to stop, too scared to think. I ended up pulling into a rest stop somewhere off the highway, parking as far from the other cars as I could. I locked the doors, covered the windows with my jacket, and tried to calm down. That's when I noticed the mark on my chest again. It was different now, bigger. The lines had spread, forming new shapes that I didn't recognize. And it wasn't just a mark anymore, it was burning. It didn't stop. When I say the mark was burning, I don't mean a mild itch or some irritation. I mean it felt like someone was branding me with a white-hot poker. I tore off my shirt and looked in the rearview mirror, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it wasn't. The mark had spread. The simple circle and triangle design now looked more intricate, with jagged lines radiating outward like veins. They weren't just on my chest anymore. They were crawling up my neck and down my arms like a parasite, trying to take over my body. And the worst part, I could see them moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were moving. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what to do. Who the hell do you call when something like this is happening? The cops? A priest? A fucking exorcist? I thought about going to a hospital, but what would I even say? Hi, yeah, I think I'm cursed by some shadow demon thing that followed me home from a job on the dark web. Oh, and by the way, it's marking me like I'm its property. Could you take a look? Number. That wasn't an option. I must have been sitting there for hours, staring blankly out the windshield, when I noticed the figure. It was a man standing at the edge of the rest stop parking lot, just outside the glow of the streetlights. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the 1920s. His face was pale, almost too pale, and his eyes, Jesus Christ, his eyes, were black. Not dark brown or hazel, pure black, like empty sockets. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I don't know why, but I rolled down the window just enough to yell out, "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile, though. It was too wide, stretching ear to ear, showing teeth that were too sharp. My stomach turned, and every instinct screamed at me to drive, but I couldn't. It was like I was frozen, locked in place by those black eyes. Finally, he spoke. His voice was deep and hollow, like it was echoing from inside a cave. "You've been marked," he said. "You belong to it now." "What the fuck are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What the hell is it?" His smile widened, if that was even possible, and he took a step closer. I wanted to roll up the window, lock the doors, drive away, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like he had some kind of hold on me. "It doesn't matter what it's called," he said. "What matters is that it chose you, and once it chooses, it doesn't stop." I felt my chest tighten, the burning sensation intensifying. I looked down and saw the mark spreading again, the lines twisting and branching like roots digging into my skin. "How do I stop it?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. The man chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You can't. Not unless it finds someone else." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "Someone else? What the hell do you mean?" His smile faded, and for the first time I saw something like pity in his eyes. "It's a chain," he said. "One link to the next. It needs a host. If you want to be free, you'll have to give it someone else." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're saying I have to..." "What? Sacrifice someone?" He nodded. "Or it will take you piece by piece until there's nothing left." My stomach twisted into knots. "I can't do that. I'm not a murderer." His smile returned, sharper than before. "You'll change your mind. They always do." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. The second he was gone, the weight lifted, and I could move again. I slammed the window shut and locked the doors, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. For the next few hours, I sat there, replaying his words in my head. It needs a host. If you want to be free, you'll have to give it someone else. The idea was sickening. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. But the burning wouldn't stop. By sunrise, the mark had spread to my face, curling around my jaw like some grotesque tattoo. Every time I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My skin was pale, my eyes bloodshot, and the lines, they were alive. Moving, shifting, growing. I knew I didn't have much time. By the second night, I was desperate. I parked my car in the lot of an abandoned gas station and started scrolling through my phone, trying to find anyone who could help. I even tried searching for the Veil Seekers forum again, but it was gone, like it had never existed. That's when I got the message. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "You're running out of time." The body of the email was blank, except for one thing: coordinates. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but what choice did I have? If there was even a chance that someone, anyone, knew how to stop this thing, I had to take it. The coordinates led to an old church in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those creepy Gothic-style buildings with stained glass windows and a bell tower that looked ready to collapse. The parking lot was empty, and the surrounding area was nothing but fields and forest. No houses, no cars, no people. I parked my car and stepped out, clutching the knife I'd been carrying since the first night. The air was cold, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The front door was unlocked, creaking open on rusty hinges. Inside, the church was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. The pews were broken, the altar covered in dust, and the only light came from the faint glow of the stained glass windows. At the far end of the room, standing in front of the altar, was the man from the rest stop. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with that awful smile. Then he raised his hand and pointed to the floor in front of him. I hesitated, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, guiding my steps like I was a puppet on strings. When I reached the altar, he finally spoke. "Are you ready to make your choice?" Standing in front of that altar, staring into the hollow black eyes of the man, or whatever he was, I felt like my body wasn't my own anymore. My legs felt like lead, my hands shook uncontrollably, and the knife I'd been clutching since this nightmare began suddenly felt useless. He kept smiling, that too wide grin that stretched his face in a way no human face should stretch. "Time is running out," he said, his voice echoing through the empty church, like it was coming from everywhere at once. "The mark grows. Soon there will be nothing left of you." I looked down at my chest. The black lines had spread across my torso and arms, crawling up my neck and around my face like vines. They weren't just moving anymore, they were pulsating, throbbing in time with my heartbeat. The pain was unbearable, like my skin was being peeled away inch by inch. What happens if I don't?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile widened, exposing teeth that looked like jagged shards of glass. "If you don't choose, it will take you, slowly, painfully. Your body will break, your mind will shatter, and you will become it. Another shadow in the dark." I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but stand there frozen. "And if I give it someone else?" I asked, hating myself for even saying the words. He leaned closer, his breath cold against my face. "If you pass it on, it will leave you. The mark will fade and you'll be free. I knew what he wanted me to do. I'd known since the moment he said, someone else. He wanted me to bring someone here, to offer them up as a replacement, a sacrifice. But the thought of it made me sick. How could I do that? How could I live with myself knowing I'd condemned another person to this hell? I shook my head, backing away from the altar. "Number, I'm not doing it." His expression didn't change, but the air in the church grew colder, heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. "You think you're being noble," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But it won't save you. It won't save them. The chain will continue, with or without you." I clutched the knife tighter, the blade trembling in my hand. Why me? Why did it pick me? "Why does the storm choose the tree it strikes?" he replied, his voice calm, almost amused. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is what you do now." Suddenly, the church started to shake. The stained glass windows rattled in their frames, and the sound of that low, guttural growl filled the air. It was here. The thing, the shadow that had been following me, was in the church. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but I couldn't see it. I could feel it, though. It was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. The growl turned into whispers, dozens of voices speaking in that same horrible, overlapping rhythm. The mark on my skin burned hotter than ever, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. "Choose," the man said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Choose, or it will choose for you." I don't know what happened next. 1 second, I was kneeling on the cold stone floor, clutching my chest in agony. The next, I was back in my car, parked on the side of the road. It was like I'd blacked out, like my brain couldn't handle whatever had just happened in that church. The knife was still in my hand, the blade streaked with something dark and sticky. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and the mark on my chest. It was gone. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it was over, that somehow I'd escaped. But then I noticed something in the passenger seat. A phone. It wasn't mine. The screen lit up with a single notification. New job assigned. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know. But the screen stayed on, the notification taunting me, until I finally gave in. I picked up the phone and opened the message. The job description was simple. Investigate a rural property. Reports of unnatural sounds and sightings. $10,000 for 12 hours of footage. The coordinates were included. My stomach twisted into knots. It was the same job, the same description, the same everything. It was like I'd been thrown back to the beginning, trapped in some endless loop. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone out the window, but I couldn't. My hands wouldn't let me. Instead, they typed a reply. I accept. The phone buzzed with a confirmation message, and I felt the weight of the decision settle over me. I didn't know why I'd done it. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the mark, still lingering somewhere inside me, forcing my hand. Or maybe it was something darker, something I didn't want to admit to myself. As I drove toward the coordinates, the phone buzzed again. A new message appeared on the screen. Bring someone with you. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and glanced at the empty passenger seat. My mind raced, torn between the horror of what I was about to do and the desperate need to survive. The growl returned, low and menacing, echoing in the back of my mind. I had made my choice, and now someone else would have to pay the price.